Good evening and welcome to the 9th Flop 26 live stream. Many thanks for watching and many thanks to the supporters. This wouldn't have been possible without you. Please consider supporting if you can, and if you can't, or even if you can, please subscribe to the channel and like and most importantly share the content so that more people see these conversations, to see that there is an alternative to COP26. In 2002, the WHO released a report which claimed that 150,000 people a year are killed by climate change. This figure was achieved by estimating how much the mortality rates of malaria, malnutrition, and diarrhea were increased by per degree of temperature rise. And here we have a table of that data. You can see there in the high mortality, I'll make that larger. You can see in the column of high mortality developing countries, HMDCs column, and in the 23rd line down, climate change appears to take the lives of 73,000 males and 75,000 females. But you'll notice that it takes a very few lives in low mortality developing countries and no lives in developed countries. This report was used to claim that both that climate change will be worse for the poor and that climate change is the greatest threat mankind has ever faced. So back in the day, at the beginning of my climate journey, I suppose, I was keen to see how climate change compared to other risk factors by poor people in other parts of the world. Here's my reanalysis of that table. As you can see, in 2002, malnutrition was nearly 24 times as fatal as climate change. And in total, the risk factors greater than climate change amounted to 180 times as many fatalities. Now, you may think that things have got worse since 2002 as the globe has warmed, but here's a chart from the Lancet's Countdown project, their contribution to climate ideology and propaganda, which shows that since the WHO's 2002 report, the mortality rates of malaria, malnutrition, and diarrhea and other diseases have fallen dramatically. So it would seem that attempts in the 2000s to persuade people of the moral imperative of tackling climate change were misleading. The claim that climate change is the biggest threat facing mankind was wrong in 2002, and the claim that it was going to get worse has been proven wrong now. Joining me tonight to discuss the moral claims of the Green Movement is writer, philosopher, and founder and president of the Center of Industrial Progress and author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, Alex Epstein. Good evening, Alex.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Most welcome. May I start by could you give us a very brief overview of your book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and then, if you can, I believe you've just finished a new book as well.
Fossil Future.
Right. Yeah. So give us the overview of those if you can.
Yeah, I'll give you sort of what's common in them. I mean, Fossil Future is newer and more focused on the future, so I'll more focus on that. I think so. My view about the whole energy and climate discussion / debate is that 90% of the disagreement is philosophical and 10% is over facts. And my view is that if you look at the issues from a pro-human philosophy, it's very obvious that there's no climate catastrophe, and it's very obvious that the world should be using more fossil fuel, not less. And, both of those conclusions sound crazy if you sort of go by received numbers, right? Because climate catastrophe seems like it's something that everyone agrees about, and certainly many people agree about it. And then the idea of using more fossil fuels seems totally off the table because we're talking about different strategies of how to rapidly eliminate fossil fuels by 2030. That's by 2050 rather. That's what net zero means. But I think it's all based on anti-human philosophy. So my basic approach is to look at the world and fossil fuels' role in it now and in the future from what I would call a human flourishing perspective. And so this has three key elements. So one element is that when we're thinking about what to do, there's always a question of what's our primary goal. And that serves as the standard by which we evaluate different options. And I think the primary goal should be to advance human flourishing around the world. So our ability to live long, healthy, fulfilling lives. And I think the prevailing way of thinking about the world, even though many people would feel resonant with the idea of advancing human flourishing, I think the real goal that's animating most thinking and most evaluation is the goal of eliminating human impact on Earth. That's really what being green means. It means eliminating human impact. And if you notice the whole focus on climate, the focus is not on climate livability, which is the human flourishing perspective. How livable is climate, including some of the things you mentioned in terms of how does it affect our ability to protect ourselves from malaria and other things like that. The focus is on climate change and in particularly on eliminating our impact on climate. You notice the net zero, that whole focus is just not let's make the climate livable, but let's just eliminate our impact on it. And I think this is a broader symptom of a philosophy that says the ultimate goal or the primary goal is to eliminate our impact. And I think you can see that is the root of why there's also opposition to nuclear, which you would expect people to be pro-nuclear, given that it's low CO2, it's reliable, right? But they're against nuclear. And it's because there's this idea, well, it's making these impacts on nature that are wrong because they're somehow unnatural and we're playing God. And then you see with hydro as well. Why is there opposition to hydro, which is, quote, renewable? Well, it's interfering with free-flowing rivers. It's, so it's, again, it's impacting nature and we want to eliminate our impact. And you even look at solar and wind, which have mass opposition around the world. They're being slowed in terms of the building of them, not for economic reasons, unfortunately, but the building of them, the building of transmission lines, the mining for them, all of these face mass opposition. Why? Because of the impact on nature. So the actual guiding goal and standard of our thinking about energy and climate is eliminating human impact. And I regard that as an anti-human and therefore evil goal, because human beings survive by intelligently impacting nature. So I think that's the core thing, is the question of what is your goal / standard of evaluation. And I think if you just look at it, the world consistently from a human flourishing perspective, that you'll really start to see that this view of climate catastrophe is wrong. For example, in the realm of our safety from climate, it's documented that, and I think you had a graph to this effect, the rate.
We may have lost you, Alex. Can we hear it? Can anyone in the audience, can you hear Alex? Are you maybe back? Are you back?
Can you hear me now?
Very low quality, but we can hear you, yes.
Oh, hold on. Let me see what I can do. Hold on 1 second. There's
While you're fixing it, we'll just have a quick look at your show on GB News, if that's right, while you're fixing your mic, because that was I think that's going to be entertaining. All right. Here you go, viewers. You may have seen Alex on GB News, but if not, here he was.
You say that, Alex, though, but in the end, Lord Demnon was just on saying that almost every scientist in the world is on the same page as him. They're not on the same page as you.
No, I mean, that guy is a total fraud if you look at what he said. His characterization of every scientist saying that we're headed for disaster is demonstrably false. What he's doing is he's taking the fact that there's consensus that we have some impact on climate and equating that with consensus on climate catastrophe. So that is a total equivocation. That's a basic fallacy in philosophy. And I don't know that guy. I've just studied him a little bit, but he is a charlatan even just doing that, or he's totally ignorant of the actual science.
But why do you think you're so right, and so many other people? It seems like actually probably the vast majority of people, at least in the science world, disagree with you. Why do you think you're right?
Well, first of all, I don't think you have a clear idea of what most people in science think, since that's all filtered through different institutions. But the basic reason I'm right and they're wrong is I think of things from a consistently pro-human perspective. So I look at the world in terms of I want to maximize human flourishing, and I look carefully at the full context, both the benefits and side effects of different options. Most people look at the world, or most people in the media look at the world from the perspective that human impact is evil, that we should eliminate it at all costs, and they only look for negative side effects of fossil fuels. That's how they can be totally ignorant of the fact that fossil fuels have made the world amazing. If you don't admit that today's world is amazing because of fossil fuels, you are totally unqualified to make any predictions about the future, because either you are anti-human or ignorant.
Strong stuff. Alex, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I was going to go through some clips from COP26 before we got a bit more into your book, but and just get your comment on them. You can comment on that if you like. But what I'd like to say to you is thank you. I think you probably speak for a great many, if not the majority, of people in Britain who have never seen John Gummer, the Lord Debon, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, challenged in that way that he needs to be.
Oh, really?
That's right. Yeah, not. I mean,
I really found him. People don't see the clip that I was responding to, but it was just this crazy. I mean, it was just this seemingly definitive confidence in the idea that everyone agrees that fossil fuels are causing a climate catastrophe, and that it's obvious that we need to rapidly eliminate them. And I found that to be such a misrepresentation of what thoughtful people actually think, that you couldn't responsibly do that.
Yeah. He evades criticism. He evades debate. All of the essentially the climate technocrats in Britain are very good at protecting themselves from any questioning. I'm thinking of people like Nick Stern, who's probably got a more of an international reputation for his sort of his big climate change work in 2006 or 7. But yeah, it's famously very difficult to get anyone to account, much less even explain the moral case as you did. So that was remarkable. And I think your interviewer was slightly taken aback with the truth, basically. Some people are saying, could you move, if it's comfortable for you, could you move slightly closer, because you're on your computer's microphone, so it may be better quality if you're.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is there's something that's. Is it still hard? There's my primary mic has somehow gone out, so I'm now using the secondary one.
I think it's fine. It's a bit better if you're slightly closer. So okay,
I will stay closer, and feel free to remind me if I fail.
We'll do. So here's another clip, I think. No. Here's a story from the UK. This is the UK chief scientific advisor, claiming that climate change is a far bigger problem than coronavirus, and that's with the virus. Oh, I haven't shared the screen. Hold on. That the virus is going to affect us for 2 to 4 years, whereas climate change could affect us for up to a century. What are your thoughts on that kind of intervention, I guess is the word.
Yeah, I think it's just sort of going back to my overall approach. So it's just very quickly, I'm looking at the world from a human flourishing perspective, and that means if you're part of that is looking at any individual technology or product, and I think we need to think of fossil fuels that way, is that you need to carefully weigh benefits and side effects. I think one thing that's gone wrong with the issue of climate is because what people call climate change is really the climate impacts of rising CO2 levels from fossil fuels. So it's really a side effect of fossil fuel use. So one thing is you need to look at both potential negatives and positives. You can't just assume they're all negative. But the other thing is you always have to look at the ability to produce energy that comes along with fossil fuels. And I think that's the biggest thing that gets left out. So with something like COVID-19 or any of these kinds of disasters, people are thinking about, rather, when they're thinking about negatives of climate and comparing them to COVID-19, they're not thinking about things like, well, it's only because we have fossil-fueled machines making us so productive that we can fight COVID-19 to the extent that we can protect ourselves from these natural disasters. And that's why climate-related disaster deaths are down 98% over the last century. It's because we have this incredible productive ability that enables us to produce all kinds of protections against climate, like drought relief, like sturdy buildings, like heating and air conditioning, and all of those depend on machines, and 80% of those are powered by fossil fuels. So I think most of this stuff, once you look carefully at the benefits and side effects of fossil fuels, it becomes revealed that all this stuff doesn't make any sense
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting to see senior scientists, senior technocrats very much geared around the idea of emergencies and not geared around the potential of science and of society of creating wealth, like all of that energy into sort of what slightly self-serving what ifs, I think. But it's generally a pity to see that sort of thing. Let's go on to the next story. Here, this is a story from COP26, a speaker from Kenya, which is about a minute long. I'll stop it if it goes past the point.
The decisions you make here will help determine whether the rains will return to our land. The decisions you make here will help determine whether the fruit trees we plant will live or perish. The decisions you make here will help determine whether children will have food and water. I believe in our human capacity.
The point I want to pick her up on there is the decision at COP26 is going to make any difference to her fruit trees. I got this data today from the UN FAO stat, Food and Agriculture Organization, which seems to suggest that production and indices and yield are pretty healthy, certainly for bananas too. So I couldn't quite work out what the fresh fruit category meant, because it's apparently a great deal less than bananas, which I presume are fresh fruit. And then the same story is true for most fruit. I would say pineapples there was a bit of a problem with, but that may have been people growing mangoes instead. It looks like there may have been some economic decisions going on there. Maybe so. What's surprising there is there's a UN meeting, Alex, and no one has said to her, you know that your country is producing quite a good amount of fruit compared to the 1970s.
Yes, this relates to another defect of the climate debate, which is what I call the delicate nurturer assumption, which is the idea that the Earth, unimpacted by humans, is this stable, sufficient, and safe place. And in reality, the Earth is, I call it wild potential. So it's dynamic, deficient, and dangerous. And once you recognize the actual nature, so her narrative is right, as long as we don't impact the climate, then the fruit trees will grow and we'll have plenty of food. But if we do impact the climate, it's going to all crash. There's this delicate balance and it's going to be destroyed. And the reality is, no, there is no delicate balance. There's this dynamic, deficient, dangerous state that we can only overcome to the extent we have productive ability. So really the livability of the Earth and any environment on the Earth is dependent on our productive ability. And that's what's totally missing here, is that she's not thinking about what's our productive ability and then what does that depend on? Well, in agriculture, it totally depends on fossil fuel derived fertilizer and above all fossil fueled machines like the modern harvesters, in the case of wheat, where you can reap and thresh 700 times more wheat than the best manual laborer. It's that kind of thing. And then the other thing you'll notice that also relates to this delicate nurture idea is just the assumption that if we impact the Earth with more CO2, it's going to be all bad. She talks about like no water and no fruit. Like, what do we know about the history of the Earth? The parts with more CO2 and higher temperatures are more tropical Earth. Tropical weather is more distributed. Is that when the dinosaurs had very high temperatures relative to us and huge amounts of CO2, not actually perfectly correlated as people think, but was that a time with low plant life? No, a more tropical world is a wetter world, is a more abundant world. you could say, I'm concerned that, hey, getting there, sea levels will rise more quickly than you'd like. Like, you can worry about some aspects being disrupted, but this whole idea that a more tropical world is going to be this deadly, drought-ridden hell, that's just a primitive religious belief that all human impact is bad because the earth is a delicate nurturer.
True. And here's a story, the last one, that I think really plays into some of that. It's a very weird moral framing. Rich countries pushing back on paying for climate loss. So there's this, rich countries are in fact sort of pushing this sort of argument towards reparations to emerging and developing economies, but then saying no, we don't want to pay. It's a trap, isn't it? It's a weird moral trap, and that there's nothing better to say, to discuss, than who is responsible. And
it's so, there's so many moral inversions, I think, because the reality is that the fossil fueled productive ability of the wealthy world has made everybody far, far better off. You look at life expectancy skyrocketing around the world. You look at what happens when you have, say, a potential drought disaster in Africa now compared to even 30 years ago, or bad storm. It's just so much better because of our productive ability to alleviate those sorts of things, that those differences so far outweigh any negative climate changes that have happened, if they even are net negative, which I think is very questionable. So that's not ignored. But then what we are doing that's bad is we are deliberately discouraging poor nations from using fossil fuels. So that's evil that we're doing that. But then the pushback from them is, no, give us a bunch of climate welfare for all the damage you've done to us. And it's like, no, we haven't done damage to you. You haven't been productive enough, in large part because your governments are not free. And certainly you can say in some cases there's responsibility of the rich world involved in that. But the main thing is that governments around the world have to become free societies. And then that's naturally going to allow them to and encourage them to use fossil fuels to become more productive and more prosperous. So they should be embracing that. But instead they're saying, oh no, give us a bunch of climate welfare that's just going to be funneled through the same usual dictators. And then they're also saying, why doesn't the West or the wealthy world deindustrialize? So they're saying you should go net zero by 2030. Can you imagine anything more genocidal for the poor world than the rich world going net zero by 2030 and destroying itself? Like, you do not, if you're in the poor world, you do not want to live in a world where the rich world is not rich.
And the rich world won't finance projects such as coal plants and extractive industries, I guess, as well. Like that's been closed down. That could have been a much better gift.
That's what we should be doing. I mean, really liberating and encouraging. In Fossil Future, I talk a lot about this, that you really need the freedom to trade in these countries, including just the ability to make contracts and to have rule of law. There's so much that doesn't happen, particularly in Africa, because there's just not the legal framework that's necessary for people to actually make profitable investments. You look at places in Asia that have become very wealthy, one common denominator is that investors can feel secure that if they invest in a lot of capital, particularly manufacturing, and often that involves associated investments in the grid and local energy infrastructure, like they know that that's a proven formula for raising people out of poverty. But if you don't have property rights, if you don't have rule of law, if you don't have the ability to trade, then it's not going to happen. And so we need to encourage that. And we sure as hell should not be discouraging them from using fossil fuels. We should encourage them to use them as well as to develop them.
Yeah, and I guess some secure energy supply would help with the value added production as well of things, that not just to leave people in make it doing primary growing stuff. To develop a broader economy. Anyway, look, I want to get back to basics here on your book, and I wondered if you could describe, if it's what you're arguing, is there like a fundamental conflict between humanism and environmentalism as it's currently constituted? I mean, if we take the view that the protection of the planet, I suppose this is going on a bit, requires a process like the UNFCCC, the COP26, then we must necessarily take the view that the protection of the planet requires the suspension of democracy, which I think is pretty important to humanism, and the closure of open, free, transparent debate, which I think is also fundamental. And does this imply also at a deeper level that humans are and nature are somehow in some kind of conflict also? And does that make environmentalism anti-human? So there's a lot there. If you want to make,
I think there are two issues. So I'll address both. But I think the first one is just these basic ideas of modern environmentalism versus humanism, and then there's this issue of which I think comes from modern environmentalism, of this idea of, we're in such an unprecedented catastrophe that we need to suspend the ability to discuss things and the ability to vote. So we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I think modern environmentalism, like I do not identify as an environmentalist. And the reason is because, that if you're saying I'm an ism, it really means what's the primary thing that I'm focused on in a given context. And so I think of myself as I'm a humanist who values a good environment for humans. So I think of the earth as, I'm looking at it as a human environment. How nourishing, safe, opportunity-filled is earth? And when I'm looking at it, I do not have a bias against things that humans create. And I think it's very pervasive to have a bias against things that humans create. So I don't look at it as, like a waterfall is good and a factory is bad. A bird is good and a farm is bad. No, they're all part of our environment, and they're all, quote, natural in the sense of we are part of nature. We're just the part of nature that has these amazing minds and therefore productive ability. So I'm just looking at it so if you look at the world from a human flourishing perspective, you don't have an antagonism toward the rest of nature, nor this uncritical protagonism. You evaluate things. So you think, for instance, this malarial mosquito, I want to get rid of that. This polar bear, I might like to observe it, but I really need to have it separate from me so it can't kill me. And then, this little dog that I own, I'm going to give him huge amounts of resources because I really like him. So there's this view of, you're pro the rest of nature, anti, versus it's really that you have a pro-human relationship with the rest of nature. And so if you look at it that way, the humanist perspective is totally at odds with the modern so-called environmentalist perspective, because that really says that all human impact is evil. And it says we should eliminate that, we should minimize that. And people often associate that with, we just want to minimize harmful things to us like pollution or senseless destruction of natural beauty. But that's not how it works in practice. In practice, it means all of our impact is bad. That's why there's so much hostility toward every form of cost-effective energy, as I mentioned before. So yeah, this I think ultimately, are you looking at the world from the perspective of I want to advance human flourishing, or I want to eliminate human impact? And eliminate human impact really means eliminate human beings, because we survive by impact. If somebody came one day and said, hey, my philosophy of the earth is I want to eliminate bear impact, right? You would think, this person hates bears and wants to kill bears, right? And so if we have a philosophy that says let's eliminate human impact, that is a thinly disguised anti-human philosophy. And then I think if you look at the world from a pro-human philosophy, you have to acknowledge that the world has never been better. It's never been more livable, never been more nourishing, safe, opportunity-filled for humans. And in particular, from climate, I mentioned 98% decline in climate-related deaths. That means we're 50 times safer than we've ever been from climate. So we're actually in the middle of a climate renaissance, not a climate catastrophe, because our productive ability makes climate so livable. So then if you take that world, and then all these people saying, we can't have voting anymore, you can't talk, it's such an emergency. It's an emergency from an anti-human perspective. That is, they're saying it's an emergency because we've impacted Earth so much. But their view is, it's inherently evil to impact climate. It's like they have a climate Bible or climate tablet that says, thou shalt not impact climate. And the number one command is thou shalt not impact Earth. And kind of this 1A is thou shalt not impact climate. But they're viewing climate as a catastrophe because we've impacted it, not because it's actually a problem for us. Now, there's an interesting question. What if the theoretical possibility happened that the side effect of our main energy source did cause a kind of catastrophe? What would you do? That's theoretically possible and worth examining. But if that were actually happening, one thing that would happen is people would absolutely talk about the incredible value of the energy we were getting and why that was indispensable. And they would also talk about the fundamental value of freedom to our entire productive ability and livelihood. So when people say, oh, there's an existential threat, but my first impulse is to destroy energy and destroy freedom, they have no understanding of human existence and what makes it good in the first place.
Yeah, there's something very tragic about that old environmentalist formula, IPAT, impact equals population.
Right,
times
that's
effort
very
equals-
revealing.
And I know so. And recently, people have tried. Some Greens have tried to roll it back, and they've tried to say, "We don't really want to reduce the population. We're about A and T. We want to reduce affluence, well, or we want to reduce technology. Well, that's even. Well, I mean, where do you start with
Reducing
that?
life in one way or another.
Yeah. I try and say to people, that's like trying to say I believe in sine and cosine, but I don't believe in tan. Right?
It's a pretty sophisticated analogy. I get it.
Yeah, it's probably lost on them because their numbers aren't their thing, and certainly I think mathematics aren't. But you could the other trinity I thought was like a Catholic, but you believe in the Father and the Son, but not the Holy Ghost, right? You get to pick and you don't get to pick and choose these framings. You always and it's a subtext to a lot of green thinking. It really, it's people that are the problem. It's people that are the problem. Even if you're not arguing for population reduction, you're arguing for some kind of constraint on people, and I don't think it can be avoided.
Notice the I. So it's impact equals population times affluence times technology. So the two bad ideas are both at work. So one perspective on this is just impact is morally bad. Like human impact is viewed as bad. That's weird, right? Why bear impact we don't view as bad, bird impact. Like we have this anti-humanism that specifically segregates us and says we're the only bad part of nature. I often call this human racism because it's the view that anything the human race does is bad and anything the rest of nature does is great and so-called natural. So there's the perspective of impact is bad, and so that's a wrong idea morally. But then there's also the perspective of the impact means, oh, there's a certain threshold, they'll call it the carrying capacity. So the earth can only handle a certain amount of human impact. And that's this delicate nurture assumption that, oh, it's this delicate balance and it can only handle so much of us kind of moving things around and then the balance is destroyed. Whereas in reality, the impact is our productive ability. That's what it is, right? And so there's no limit to the amount it can handle as long as it's actually productive, actually adding value. You want as much of it as you can get. Unfortunately, the whole earth is just raw matter and energy waiting to be productively reshaped by us. And then, of course, there's the rest of the universe. So it's just so wrong that impact is bad and that it's self-destructive. But that's the basic anti-human religion, the idea that human impact on nature is intrinsically immoral and inevitably self-destructive. So IPAT captures both of those fallacies.
I think people pointed out as well, have they, the shape of not to take too, not to sort of stick to their terms, but impact is N-shaped, right? You get your impact increases as you begin industrial society, and then we do nice things, right? We turn nature into an amenity.
Well, it's a weird thing. Yeah, so there's this Kuznets curve and stuff where it's the thing that is true is that as you become wealthier, that really means you have more productive ability. You can decide to optimize for like, hey, I want to produce a lot of stuff, but I want to produce it with less waste. You can do stuff like that. But I think this is often falsely characterized as, first we become wealthy and then we improve our environment. Whereas from my perspective, from a humanistic perspective, it's all improving our environment. So even when people were using coal and there was a lot of soot, they were improving their environment. They were preventing themselves from freezing to death. They were preventing themselves from dying of starvation. They were freeing up time for themselves to enjoy the world. Now, there were certain negative side effects with that, as there were when they're using wood and that kind of thing. But I would encourage people to think in a more holistic and humanistic way about environment. And then I really caution against when people talk about the environment, because it often means the unimpacted environment. And it's as this thing separate from and superior to human beings, whereas it's really our environment. So if you think about our environment from a humanistic perspective, everything in it that we produce is intended to make this world a better environment for us. So I think like a plastic cup, as that's part of the world being a good environment. It gives me a sanitary and fast way to nourish myself. If I landed on an island that had a bunch of nature-made plastic cups, I would think this is a much better environment without nature, without those plastic cups, right? So the fact that we made them doesn't make it, quote, bad for the environment. It makes it we're making it a better environment.
That's a neat little bit of a distinction between you and the latter eco-modernists. I think that's
there's definitely a lot of distinctions.
Yeah. Well, we'll maybe explore those a bit. But I want to talk briefly about the sort of expectation that exists that science can answer questions and give essentially moral instructions to us, and that there's just more than a hint of scientism in the green agenda and in environmentalism, or certain parts of environmentalism, maybe not deep ecology, and yet scientists themselves don't really challenge the bad science of the alarmism. Nobody's standing up to tell Boris Johnson at COP26 that he's wrong. There aren't more storms, or there aren't more floods. I mean, there are certainly researchers who do, but they generally get even on the pro-climate side. But the institutional science is where I'm normally driving that criticism. It doesn't say, no, Mr. Johnson is wrong, or even Mr. Obama, as he was speaking the other day in COP26.
Well, I think there are two separate but related issues there, because when you're talking about science, there's just this conflation of, here are certain scientific facts or conclusions, and then that automatically tells us what evaluation to come to. And so that's a really important fallacy that's involved there, because what it allows people to do is just, it ends up making these dictators out of these, what I call designated expert scientists, like somebody like Michael Mann or Paul Ehrlich or John Holdren, where it's in this refrain, listen to the scientists, right? But it's equating, listen to them on what's the truth about climate versus listen to them about what your energy policy should be. And that's a big step. So it's really important to separate what are the facts about a certain area, and then what's your method of evaluation that's going to involve considering those facts. But it's also going to involve considering other facts, like facts about energy in this case. And then it's also, the key is it's going to have a standard of evaluation. By what metric or standard are you evaluating things? And so what happens is we don't think about the benefits of energy at all. We just think about negative side effects. We tend to only look to people who claim to speak for scientists who say very negative things. But then our standard of evaluation, we're not very clear. Are we advancing human flourishing, or are we eliminating human impact? And so the default is just, we eliminate human impact. And so that's why the whole world is focused on our number one moral goal is, let's eliminate our impact on climate by 2050. That is really the overarching moral goal of the world. And that is not a defensible goal at all on a human flourishing standard. But there's also the question of, why don't scientists speak up? Like, why don't more people speak up? And the more you learn about how much distortion there is, I mentioned this in that interview you played, how much distortion there is by the system that tells us what scientists think. I call this our knowledge system. Like, how much the people who synthesize what scientists think and who disseminate it to us, there's so much distortion there. There's a question of, why don't people speak up? And I think the main reason is because most scientists are indoctrinated in the same way that most of us are, with this idea that we shouldn't be impacting the earth, that the earth exists in a delicate balance, that energy has no real value. And so the way they see the distortion of science is it's a kind of unethical or unpleasant tactic toward achieving a good end. So they don't see the end of eliminating fossil fuels as evil because of their philosophical framework they're picking up, and because of their ignorance of energy and energy's value. So it just seems kind of harmless. It's like distasteful. I don't want to participate in it. But that's different from, this is evil, and I'm gonna risk my career over it. Whereas if you have my perspective, it's like, I could never live with this. I mean, I would just feel like I mean, people think it's exaggeration, but I don't mean it that way. I mean, I consider it like I'm participating in another Holocaust, because that's what it is in terms of the goal. There are reasons to think it won't be as, quote, successful as the Holocaust, but the goal of net zero is far more deadly than the
Yes.
actual Holocaust was.
Yeah. We'll come we'll come back to some of those points, but excuse me. When I started writing about climate change in the 2000s, I reviewed a book called The Ethics of Climate Change: Right and Wrong in a Warming World. And without wanting to lower the tone, it was just crap, right? It was written by an academic philosopher, seemingly a moral philosopher, but there was no moral thinking. There was no ethical reasoning in it whatsoever. And it occurred to me that's what climate change, or the urgent necessity of climate change, was doing. It's filling a gap in the author's pretty weak philosophical understanding. He didn't really know where he stood on ancient or long-standing moral questions or principles. He had no real convictions, and he couldn't really commit himself to anything without without the emergency looming over us, looming over his argument to help him make it. So do you think the climate emergency is filling a deeper existential hole in many people's minds and public roles and institutions, and they've sort of maybe lost their, I mean, I'm probably getting a bit too deep here, but they're losing sight of their founding purpose, and perhaps seeking orientation by hitching themselves to a sort of social or political agenda, regardless of the ethical or moral questions that emerge out of that.
There's a lot of dimensions to this thing, because there's this, I mean, there's a certain kind of, like Michael Schellenberger in Apocalypse Never talks about this a bunch. And I think he has an interesting discussion, which I agree with quite a bit of, not all of, but sometimes it still come up as this is filling a hole that only religion can fill, which I don't agree with. So I'm not a religious person, but I don't feel like I have this hole. So I believe that you can, by secular reasons, have a moral life and believe in absolute morality. So that's a whole discussion in of itself, but that's definitely my view. But I think what you can say for sure, so there's a question of, but there is clearly a hole. There's clearly a lot that's missing. And I think it's worth identifying some of the ways that the needs that this fills for people that are unacknowledged. So just even it, because it's really, climate catastrophe is this unbelievably marketed thing that serves so many needs for people at such a seeming low cost to them. So you just take, like, I've been in these different protests, counter protesting these climate catastrophe protesters. Like there's a video of me in New York holding an I love fossil fuel sign, and I'm on 6th Avenue, and there are 300,000 people marching against me. And you think, like, what are these people getting out of it? Well, they were basically told, if you just hold a sign, you're going to save the world. So you're like the Avengers, right? I mean, you are great. You are one of these heroes just by saying that you believe in, quote, climate change and that you oppose fossil fuels. So it gives just so many people at minimum free status. And then there's also this element of meaning. And some people, the kind of most obvious thing people can get for meaning is, oh, there's an absolute catastrophe that I have to address right now. And so it's just an emergency. It's kind of like, okay, you imagine, a parent is like really mixed up about their life and hasn't thought clearly about what they want, but then their kid like gets in a big accident and they need to save them. Then the parent, for that moment, they can be preoccupied and they feel like I have a purpose, etc. And they don't really have to think about, like, they don't feel as lost. And I think that kind of thing definitely happens. And then you look at, what it does for people who want power. This is the ultimate reason for giving somebody unlimited power. One of my favorite books, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, one of the bureaucrat dictators in it, he just keeps saying in response to every problem, I need wider powers. And that's what everyone says now. It's right. Like, we need wider powers. You mentioned before, like, we need to suppress speech. We need to not allow people to vote democratically on leaders. So it satisfies the power lusters, but it also just satisfies everyone who's against capitalism, which is unfortunately a lot of people. The modern environmental movement was a very big strategy post-Vietnam War, post like the beginning of the collapse of communism, to give the anti-capitalist side like a new cause. This was an explicit strategy in the late 60s and early 70s. That's very well documented. So it satisfies all these different needs. And I think it's important for people to know this so that you don't just think it's a bunch of, because the way we're taught to think of it is, oh, there's a bunch of brilliant scientists and they all independently said there's a climate catastrophe and we have to take this common sense step of getting rid of fossil fuels. And there's nothing resembling that. There's not a bunch of Galileos. There's a bunch of institutions that have very deep anti-human philosophies, and that there's a lot of basic needs that are not very healthy that are being satisfied by this. And that's what explains, like if you see a Mark Carney type person, or I forget the guy's name. I'm not a big fan of using the word Lord, but I think Lord Devon, is that the guy's name?
Lord Deben, or
Deben,
Deben. He styled himself as that. His real name is John Gummer.
Oh, Gummer. Okay. Well, I don't even know how to figure out where that comes from, but he's like, these are not, I mean, to say they're not giants is to be very nice about it. Like, these are really problematic people who are like acting out some very unhealthy motives at great expense to humanity. And part of what's going on is there's the philosophy and there's a bunch of factual confusions that enable them to feel like, that enable them to play the part of, oh yeah, Mark Carney's this amazing guy saving the world. And I view him as, no, this is like a really bad villain.
Right. Yeah. So Rupert Darwell the other day called Mark Carney. We were having a discussion on this on this live stream. He said, I think it was Mark Carney's an anti-capitalist who believes in capital. Or so I wish I could remember the formulation, but it's a very weird tension going on with him. Alex, we've been talking for 45 minutes. Can I just quickly ask, are you going to be we talked about an hour, but I'm only making a little bit of progress through my notes. Are you able to add another 10 minutes onto that?
I can add another 10 minutes, but then I gotta actually have a big TV appearance in the US tonight, so get ready for that.
Okay, I'll try and get through.
I'll answer quickly. I will be more concise.
Well, we've got
solve our problem.
I want to play this little. I want to bring it forward from. So we sort of talked quite abstract. I want to sort of demonstrate what we've really been talking about with this clip from a slightly older BBC show, a news clip a few years ago. So I'll just play that.
Could this be a vision of our future? This is what it's like living in the worst air pollution in the world. Cities growing unchecked, filthy air, the silent effect of climate change. Is this toxic cocktail pushing our civilization to its limits?
It's morning in Ulaanbaatar and people are going to work, getting ready to go to school. And I can smell the pollution. It's so thick, you can even taste it. I've got a pollution monitor here and it's measuring PM 2.5, which is these tiny...
So I'll just pause it there and I'll scroll to another significant moment. Here we go. So here she's interviewing some Mongolians in a...
You think you'll be able to stay here in the countryside?
ерөнхийдөө одоо энэ нэг өдрөл ингэ янз гаж үзэл болонгод нэг өдрөл энэ мал чинь угаасаа харахын зуртгүй байх болно. Тэгэхээр чааш таавж явах юу л байхгүй, итгэх юу л байхгүй, баталгаа байхгүй. Мал бол.
Look what they're cooking on. That's the thing.
Chairman Monk wants to find work as a chef in the city.
Right. So that show for me really encapsulates things. The story there, just to make it clear, is there was climate change has made it difficult for Mongolians who lived sort of nomadic lifestyles on the plains, driving horses and cattle. The climate change the extreme weather, they claimed, has forced people off the land into the cities where they burn coal, which pollutes the air, which damages children's lungs. Now, I have another statistic here, if I can find that. Oops. Yeah, child mortality in Mongolia, and that's a radical. I mean, just
didn't make it into the story.
Oh no,
the segment.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I was sort of so outraged. I emailed them, which I don't normally bother. So yeah, you saw they were cooking in a yurt, right? And they were kids in the 1950s and 60s born in those conditions may have well frozen or starved to death, and no one would have ever known. So in my view, and I think we agree on this. Yeah, it's the air. It might be a bit stinky in the Mongolian capital, where people are burning a lot of a lot of coal, but that is a story of progress, isn't it? So, this is how our ideology frames the news. Green ideology frames the news, and omits the story of that graph.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's a more livable world for children, which you would think they would care about. But again, the whole framing of it is that human impact is evil and it's inevitably self-destructive. But so the way it works is they just look for examples that they can try to pin on fossil fuels of things that are bad. But they're not trying to look at the full context of how good is the world now compared to what it used to be, and what is the role of fossil fuels in that positively and negatively. Because if they did, you'd get a totally different evaluation. And also, I mean, why are they even just a conflation of climate and air pollution? Like, those are totally separate issues. And just the view of the future at the beginning is like this, this terrible place and stuff. Again, the world that existed where CO2 levels were much, much higher than today, far higher than we could get to even if we wanted to, 10, 15 times higher, where temperatures were 25 degrees Fahrenheit, 11, 12 degrees Celsius warmer, which we have no idea how to get to, even with extreme climate models that have no validity, in my view. Like, those were lush tropical times on Earth, right? They were not, so it's like, yeah, we're all going to be like the Bahamas, or like, that's what it's like. Because the way warming works is generally in colder parts of the Earth. It's not evenly distributed. It's certainly not concentrated in the equator. It's the opposite. So it's a very deliberate distortion. But I want to keep highlighting is there's this anti-human philosophy that says, human impact is immoral and it's inevitably self-destructive. And that's what's shaping this not a pro-human evaluation of the actual facts.
So if you're right, and I think you are, that makes COP26 perhaps the most grotesque moral pantomime the world has ever seen, to the extent that the UNFCCC and COP26 informs the sort of perspective we've seen and gets reproduced in news media like we've seen, and across public life, and it's an abomination, isn't it, from a moral point of view? It's
I mean, that's how I viewed it. So even the flop 26 is very clever, but it's not how I think of it, because I think of it as like mass murder 2021, like attempted mass murder 2021, and so I hope it flops. But it's because the view of flop, right? It can be something bad that's flopping or something good, but flop usually means they attempted to do something that was kind of good, and then it didn't work out, or it didn't work. At least it wasn't what they said it would be. But my focus is what they're advocating in terms of the elimination of net CO2 emissions by 2050. That is mass murder of the Earth. I mean, just the basic facts are, cost-effective energy is essential to human flourishing. Fossil fuels provide 80% of it, including even more on transportation and industrial heat, which are obviously very crucial. And, the world is solar and wind are 3% of the world's energy, just electricity, and they're totally dependent on fossil fuels, nuclear and hydro. And, one of the statistics among many, as Robert Bryce points out, 3 billion people use less electricity than a typical American refrigerator. So where energy is so crucial, and we're so energy starved as a world, and they're saying, let's eliminate the one source of energy that can actually provide all forms of energy cost effectively on a global scale, and with no concern about what happens if they're wrong. Like, no concern, even though all these ideas of replacing the solar wind are total crackpot, but they don't, even if they were plausible, you would at least be worried about, hey, what if it doesn't work out? If all the machines stop working and therefore we all die? Like, there's no concern about that.
Chris Horner put it last night. He said, I think we were talking about, I can't remember, we were actually online, it was after the show, the energy crisis that's looming in the Northwest states, He said, and people are going to be frozen in their homes, quite likely to happen here as well with the energy price rises. Those people don't vote. They don't count. They're not a lobby. They're not a political party. They're not, they don't get counted.
I wish it was that. And listen, by the way, I'm a really big Chris Horner fan. He's a very courageous guy and does a lot of really important legal work that basically no one else is doing. So I'm very grateful to have him as an ally. And I think he's right about that, but I think it's much broader, just that there's no valuing of energy. I mean, you think about like it's exactly as if you discuss vaccines and you do not discuss benefits and you only discuss negative side effects. Like, you cannot possibly think rationally about a society if you don't think carefully about benefits and side effects. It's once you just see this, you see it everywhere, that nobody thinks about the benefits of fossil fuels to the billions of people who depend on them and the billions of people who need cost-effective energy and lack. It's just totally missing. That's how anti-human and energy ignorant the world is right now.
Right. So before the last question, if I may, I want to just ask you about fear-mongering itself, because we see a lot of really shocking claims which owe nothing to science of any description. And then we see really young children reproducing those stories, and 5-6 years old, and it's apparently increasingly terrified of their future and disarmed of any knowledge or understanding to make sense of them, or to sort of create a positive view for themselves. And that's the point, isn't it? This is the morality of fear-mongering, is such that, or even environmentalism, that it not only inserts a sort of unchallengeable moral imperative, it also drives people to deliberately disarm others, especially children, of the knowledge, debate, and that sense of the future. So essentially, to make them obedient and to treat people as means rather than ends, as I think Kant may have put it. If you sort of, I mean, does that feature in your book?
There's a bunch there. I think the treatment of children is really abusive. It's just, you think about, I mean, it's not even just children, right? I mean, there's eco-anxiety everywhere, but I think the younger you do it, the more abominable it is. I mean, just think about, you're creating this, it's not even like, like certain religious upbringings, I think, get rightly criticized if there's a lot of fear involved. Like, the kid just feels like, oh, this really bad thing is going to happen. But that's nothing compared to what is done today, because it's really, there's a guaranteed apocalypse that you're going to grow up into. And there's no basis in it. You take Greta Thunberg, for example. She is the luckiest person ever, right? I mean, statistically, like, she grows up in the most livable world ever, which has the most productive ability. It's such a nourishing and safe and opportunity-filled world. And she really does think it's this hell, this catastrophe that's then going to soon become an apocalypse. And you just think about what that does to somebody. I mean, like, just think about what is depression. I mean, a lot of depression is just, the belief that things are bad and they'll never get better. And that's essentially, anxiety is like fear of the future. I'm not a psychologist. These are just broad ideas. Like, both of these are just totally, they're totally part of climate catastrophe. It's like, there's this fear, there's this this terrible stuff that's going to happen, and everything is bad. And it's going to get worse. And it's the exact opposite of the truth. So I think it's so important that's why I'm so focused on the philosophy of things, is to teach people how to think about it correctly, philosophically.
So the final question then is from Martin who's a viewer. He says, technical and historical arguments around the efficiency and impact of reliable fossil fuels, even when framed in the context of maximizing human thriving, don't seem to land because the messages of the elite are on the surface anti-human. Calling someone out for being anti-human has no impact if they view it as a badge of honor. What strategies should the anti-green movement employ? I think he means that broadly, anti-green movement, in this environment. see also anti-capitalist capitalists. I think he's talking about Mark Carney there. What is to be done? I think he's asking.
I disagree with the premise of that question. I think that I do think there's a broad anti-humanism in the population, but I don't think it's mostly conscious. So I think people like this idea of eliminating human impact. Most people take that in a very charitable interpretation, though it just means clean air and clean water, and let's not kill these species for no reason, and let's not destroy this park for no reason, that kind of thing. Like most people do not hold being green or caring about the environment as really, I want to sacrifice human beings to the rest of nature. And so I think it is very powerful if you point out that, hey, first of all, positive, like, hey, I'm pro-human. I think the world today is amazing. There's a lot of room for improvement, but it's the best it's ever been, and we can make it better, and you have that aspiration. And then from that perspective, you can show, hey, the people who say that it's really bad and they don't acknowledge how we're safer than ever from climate and food is better than ever, et cetera, like those people are not looking at the world from a human perspective. They're looking at the world from a human impact is evil perspective, and that's a bad thing. I mean, all I can say is I've had a lot of success doing that, and I see a room for a lot more success. I think being very consciously pro-human, but part of that is making clear that being pro-human means having a beautiful, wonderful environment. So it's owning the issue of a good environment and safety from climate. It's not ceding that to the other side. It's actually taking that away. Because my view is the catastrophists are not bringing us safety from climate or anything else. They're going to bring us back to the days when we were perpetually afraid of climate for legitimate reasons, because we didn't have the productive ability to master it.
So at the moment, you're saying we've got to just make the arguments and recapture.
Well, reframe the discussion is the main thing. Be clear about, if you understand, like what I'm arguing is there are these three basic things going on. Are you for advancing human flourishing as your goal and standard, or are you for eliminating human impact? Do you believe that the Earth is wild potential, dynamic, deficient, dangerous, that we need to productively improve? Or do you believe that it's a delicate nurture that's stable, safe, and sufficient? And then do you look at the full context, benefits and side effects, or do you just look at negative side effects? Like if you get that those are the three things that are going wrong, it helps a lot in positioning yourself. And it's very hard for anyone to argue against you if you're really for advancing human flourishing, including a good environment. If you recognize, hey, the Earth is wild potential, it's not this delicate nurture. And if you look at the full context, that's very powerful positioning. And I think the people who are having the most success right now, like me and Schellenberger and Lomborg, we all do some form of that. We're reframing the issue in a pro-human way, and we're coming at it from a perspective that resonates with a lot of people, and that the Greens have trouble answering. And notice their answer to us is never, oh no, we hate humans. That's their only real answer, right? Our policies are good because humans are bad, and we're going to kill more humans doing our policies. But they don't say that, right? They still try to pretend they're pro-human. So I think being pro-human is the place to be.
So it's up to us to take those arguments forward and put them out there, viewers. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I could carry on the conversation forever, but I know you've got to go. I hope we'll speak again at some point, or many times in the future. So
I enjoyed it. And can I just say, I would recommend, if people want more resources, I'm on Twitter, as you might imagine, but also there's a website, energytalkingpoints.com, and you can look up any issue there and get my take with references. And there's also a mailing list where you can get my newsletter that has the latest talking points on issues. So if you're engaged in these things, I think that's a really good stockpile of ammunition for you to use.
Right, brilliant. So when's your book out?
We're still sometime in the spring. Sometime in the spring. This global printing crisis is a total debacle.
We'll look out for it.
I'm done with it.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you very much. And,
all right. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you very much to you viewers. Tomorrow, David Rose, Andrew Olowski, and Rob Lyons are going to be joining me to talk about the disappearing art of journalism. It's fast becoming verboten, especially in the field of climate change in these censorious times. Quite likely, there's going to be no show on Thursday to this time management issues, but there will be a Flop 26 live stream for each day of COP, even if it's not actually on each day of COP. So that should be a chance for you to catch up with the shows if you've been busy. Thanks very much for watching, and see you tomorrow about 8 p.m. Bye-bye.